So again, this was on the quizzes from last week. So it says solve the inequality, and it's the square root of 2x minus 6 is less than or equal to 5. So to get rid of a square root, I would square both sides of this equation, and I get 2x minus 6 is less than or equal to 25. Add the 6. 2x less than or equal to 31, divide by 2, and I get x is less than or equal to 31 over 2, and half of you went, whoop, that's right, I circle my answer and I'm done. But here's the catch with square roots. Square roots cannot be negative, right? I can't square root a negative number. So if it's a square root is less than something, you obviously solve it the way you should, but you also have to keep in mind that there's a lower bound here. Whatever's underneath this has to be greater than or equal to 0. It can be 0. You can square root 0, but it also, so it would have to be greater than or equal to 6, x greater than or equal to 3. So actually this should have been, right, it's not there. This should have been greater than or equal to, and then this should have been the correct answer, okay? It has to be, there's a lower bound, only really if this is less than. Obviously, if it's greater than, then there's just, you're always going to be greater than. But if it's less than, you have to take into account that it's going to have a lower bound. Just be careful, because if it said something like negative 2 square root of 2x minus 6 is greater than or equal to 10, you would have to first divide both sides by negative 2 before you look to see if it's less than or greater than. Once you divided, if I had worked this out and divided by negative 2 here, square root of 2x minus 6 would have been less than or equal to, now it would have been negative 5. And this would have been a no solution, because no square root could be less than a negative. So just remember all your rules on square roots and keep them in mind. Same thing with absolute value. Like if that was an absolute value number, it couldn't be negative either. So just be careful. Don't get excited because you see the answer that you got and just circle it and move on, especially multiple choice. That means all those points are gone. So your test.
Dealing with square roots and stuff like that.
So if the variable is squared and you go to square root the other side of the equation, that's when you have to do a plus or minus. When the variable itself is squared or raised to an even power. If you are just squaring both to get rid of a square root, so if it was the square root of x equals 5, now you're squaring both, now you don't do plus or minus. Only if your variable is raised to the even power and you go to find the square root. Like think about why that's happening, because technically if I plug, so if I had x squared equals 25, if I have x equals 5 and I plug it back in, 5 squared is 25 and that works. But also if I have negative 5 and I plug it in, negative 5 squared is 25 and that also works. The same would not be true here. So if I squared both sides, I'd get x equals 25. If you had treated it as plus or minus 25, you can plug in a positive 25 there and square root it, you get 5, but you can't plug in a negative 25.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions from the quizzes before I get into the PDF review? All right, if you are sleepy, and I understand it was a long weekend, you had a lot of, like I felt like it was super hard to come to school today because it feels like summer started. I get it. But you have 24 hours before you take this test, so I need you to up your game. I need you to open up your PDF. I need you to be with me. I need you to make sure it is 14 questions. It's obviously covering P1 to P5. Okay, some are multiple choice and some are fill in the blank. I would actually, I think more are multiple choice than fill in the blank, but there are a little bit of both. Yeah. Yeah.
For the question we just did, I'm confused. Like, I don't know when to minus sign.
This section by section, making sure you understand it, so that there's no questions left open that tomorrow you get to and you're like, crap, I didn't ask this question. Okay. So P1 was all the different kinds of equations. It was a lot of different kinds of equations mixed into one section. Okay. It started with fractional and you know, decimals and that kind of stuff. These are the ones you want to definitely check your answers. So like 32 when I have a variable in the denominator, 35 when I have a variable in the denominator, 29 variable in the denominator. All of those you have to check your answers and make sure there's not an extraneous root. So for this one, when you solve for 32, you get 5 halves as your x. That's an okay denominator to plug in, or okay value to plug in both those denominators. If by chance I had solved and I had gotten 0 as my x, you would rule it out. Or if I had gotten 5 as an x, I would rule it out because it would make my denominator 0 and then it's undefined. So definitely check those kinds of questions. Again, if there's a denominator that has a variable, and there will be, you have to make sure you check those answers. And it's going to be a scenario kind of like the one on the quizzes where your answer that you get is going to be there, but it also might be an extraneous root. So be very, very careful. Okay, then came like quadratic equation, came even root property. This is where you're doing that plus and minus. So this is like 60 and 64. You would square root both sides, putting the plus and minus at the front. And then you'll see, like, if it's a typed in answer, it will tell you how to type it in. If it's a yucky format like this, it's probably going to be multiple choice. Any questions on this first page before we keep going? We're good, yeah? All right. Then came, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
When you're completing the square,
yeah,
it's like you have to divide the middle term by 2 and then square, right, for the last one?
Correct.
Okay.
And then the quadratic formula. So if the directions on the test say solve using the quadratic formula, the box of that answer better show the work of solving using the quadratic formula. So I'm going to nitpick on that kind of stuff, and I'll take off the credit if I need to. Just pay attention because it will say that. It'll either say solve by the quadratic formula, solve by factoring, that kind of stuff. Just make sure that you read the directions. Everybody's good? Okay. And those answers will be kept exact. So you're not like rounding that square root and giving me some ugly number. Okay. Those will be kept exact. Either together like this or separated like this. And again, those kind of, if it's an ugly format, it's probably going to be a multiple choice answer. All right, then comes the factoring. So you want to make sure you review all the different kinds of factoring, just like your different to 2 squares. Your this one has a fourth root on it, right? That would be factored and then factored again. Factoring by grouping, perfect square trinomials, your regular trinomials, trinomials with a number on the front, like all the different kinds of factoring we've done throughout the school year could show up. Then came your square root equations like 124. And that's also one you have to check because it starts with a square root. So if your equation starts with a square root or if it starts with a variable in the denominator, you have to check for extraneous roots. And then 131, you're raised to the 2/3. So to get rid of it, you're going to square root and then raise to the 3rd power. So you raise it to the reciprocal function, okay? Because you are square rooting it, so this would be 5 to the 3/2. It would be the square root of 5 and then cubed, okay? So that would be root 5 times root 5. No, sorry, square root. Yeah, root 5 times root 5 times root 5. So it's going to be 5 root 5. And then you'd have to subtract the 3.
Miss Priscilla,
Yeah.
where did you put some of the questions in blue?
The blue ones were the ones you did in the section.
Oh, like in the section?
Like you had already done them.
Okay.
Yeah. It was more for me, so I didn't reassign the questions than it was for you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But, like, do you want us to do them again?
You already did them.
Oh.
Yeah, you should have already done them. No. If you did the pink, it should be sufficient. If you need extra practice, go back and pick the one next to the one that's in the pink, because it's pretty much probably the same thing. Yeah.
Ms. Christopher?
Yeah.
Could you do the square root of 5 and then to the 3rd power without a calculator, or?
You can't,
You
yeah,
can
yeah, no, yeah, so it would be square root 5, square root 5, square root 5 like that. This is 5, and then the other one would stay square root 5. And then it was, what was it, x plus 3. X plus 3 equals that, so you'd subtract the 3. Okay, then came P2, which was your inequalities. So you're talking about inequalities with an equation, any compound inequalities, and or statements came in here. We talked about how we would graph these on a number line. So if it says solve and graph on the number line, you gotta put your graph on your number line, okay? It could be really like informal, like what's there. It doesn't have to be a perfectly drawn thing, but I should see the numbers and then the not open dots, closed dots, but the interval notation symbols, which would be parentheses and brackets. So again, you want to pay attention. If it says sketch the solution on the real number line, then in that box for that question needs to be the sketched number line. All right, then came the absolute value with inequality. So absolute value with inequality is where you have to figure out if it's the and or statement. Remember, once you get the absolute value on the side by itself, so not before then, but once you get the absolute value on the side by itself, you're looking at that statement, and if it's less than, it's an and statement. If it's greater than, it's an or statement. And then same thing here, it'll say solve it and graph it on the number line, or it will just say solve it.
Ms. Crusoe?
Yes.
I know we didn't have to do it but for number 72, if the 3 on the outside was negative, we have to move that first before determining if it's an and or statement, right?
Correct. And that's where you want to be really careful, because if you flip it, right, so let's say it's negative, and I divide both sides by -3, now this becomes a greater than or equal to -3. Which is that's all real numbers scenario, because every absolute value will be greater than or equal to -3. But yeah, you want to wait until it's completely on the side by itself to determine if it's and or. And remember, dividing or multiplying by a negative number is going to flip it. Okay, then came quadratic inequalities. So we have just straight up inequalities. We've got compound inequalities. We've got absolute value inequalities. And then you've got quadratic inequalities. Quadratic inequalities are where you're going to have to factor it. You're going to get the two answers. You're going to set up your number line, and you're going to test your points. And then this is, it was on the quizzes. I don't think it's in this actual thing. This is where your square roots came into play with your inequalities. And these are the ones you have to make sure that you have, if there's a lower bound. So if it said, oh, I hit the wrong thing, sorry. If it said less than this number, you're going to solve it, but then you also have to put this greater than or equal to 0 to get that lower bound, which was that question that we did from the quizzes. Yeah.
Can you do 1 through 10?
Sure. So I get x squared plus x is less than 6. I want to move the 6 to be on the side with the x squared and the x, and then it would be x plus 3 and x minus 2. Solve it, and I get -3 and I get +2. So then on my number line, I'm going to plug in a point left of -3, like -4, in between like 0 and greater than like 3. And you can plug it in up here, you can plug it in here, it doesn't matter where you plug it in, okay? If I do it from the beginning, I can say -4 squared minus 4 is less than 6. 16 minus 4 is less than 6. 12 is not less than 6. Plug in 0. 0 squared plus 0 is less than 6. 0 is less than 6. And then I would plug in 3 just to make sure, but it should be every other one. 9 plus 3 is 12. That is not less than 6. So then my solution set comes from in between these two. It would be -3 is less than x, which is less than 2, and then the graph would be that. Parentheses on -3 and 2 shaded in between. Any other questions from this page before we go to the next one? All right, P4 was your intercepts and your symmetry. So it's going to ask you to just find your x and y intercepts, make sure they're in coordinate point form, okay? And then it's going to ask you for your symmetry. Symmetry is going to be like a checkoff box. Like, does it have x-axis, y-axis, origin, or none? And you're going to check as many as apply. So you can earn partial credit on that one. Like if you do X and not the Y, something like that. Obviously, you'll earn some points, but you just got to be really careful. The intercept one, I think, is multiple choice. Yeah. Questions on intercepts or symmetry?
Excuse me?
Yeah.
What would a graph with origin symmetry, but not x or y axis symmetry? Like, is that not possible?
It would be like, well, just your y equals x line. This has origin symmetry. Your rational functions, that has origin symmetry. Your cubic function, that has origin symmetry, but would fail the other two. So this would be like a y equals x. This would be a y equals 1 over x. And this would be a y equals x to the third. Everybody's good on that stuff? All right, then came P5, which was all the equation stuff. So your slope, the finding the equation given the point and the slope, finding the equation given 2 points, finding the equation something that's parallel, perpendicular given point and slope, that kind of stuff. So those are all odds, and then here the evens are on here, but.
How can I check the odd ones?
The odd ones, I put the calc chat link. It's at the top of the module under the chapter P. So where it says chapter P and there's the PDF of the whole, all the problems, and then there's the calc chat link right there. This one, I think I didn't do 88. Did I do it at the top? Yeah, I did. Okay. And then all the evens were on this PDF. Everybody's good? No other questions? Going once. Going twice. Not going to email Miss Chris Weiser at 11:45 tonight with a question because I'm not going to answer you. Because I'll be sleeping and also because I told you so. Okay.